What if everything you've been told about spiritual power was deliberately incomplete? The most powerful spiritual figures throughout history accessed something that religious authorities have systematically hidden from ordinary believers. And Joshua, one of the Bible's most celebrated warriors, might hold the key to this forbidden knowledge that many religious leaders don't want you to discover. The story of Joshua conquering Jericho with trumpet blasts and marching is familiar to most. But what's been carefully erased from popular teaching is far more intriguing. Before he became the mighty conqueror we know, Joshua was born a slave in Egypt, given the name Hoshea, which means salvation. But Moses later changed his name to Joshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation. This seemingly minor detail contains the first clue to his forbidden power. Ancient Hebrew scholars believed names contained spiritual essence, and this name change wasn't just administrative. It was a spiritual transformation that granted Joshua access to divine power channels that others couldn't tap into. What's particularly shocking is that Joshua wasn't born special. He wasn't from a priestly family like Aaron. He wasn't a prophet like Moses. He came from the tribe of Ephraim, whose members weren't traditionally spiritual leaders. So how did this ordinary man gain such extraordinary spiritual authority? The answer lies in a practice so controversial that it's been deliberately obscured from mainstream religious teaching for centuries. The Battle of Jericho reveals the next piece of this forbidden puzzle. We're told that Joshua's army simply marched around the city for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day, before shouting and blowing trumpets, causing massive walls to collapse. But archaeological evidence from Jericho tells a different story. Excavations have revealed that the city had experienced powerful seismic activity around this time period. What if Joshua had knowledge of how to predict, or even influence, natural forces? Ancient texts from nearby cultures mention spiritual practices for communicating with earth energies. The specific 7-day ritual Joshua implemented mirrors certain forbidden practices found in ancient Sumerian texts dealing with earth-based spiritual powers. These similarities have been systematically downplayed by religious authorities who prefer the miracle explanation over the possibility that Joshua accessed forbidden knowledge. The most compelling evidence of Joshua's secret power source comes from his unique relationship with the Ark of the Covenant. While Moses communicated with God at the tent of meeting, Joshua had unprecedented access to the Ark itself, an object so charged with spiritual energy that touching it inappropriately resulted in immediate death. The Bible clearly states that the Ark contained mysterious objects: the stone tablets, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. But ancient rabbinical texts hint at something else, that the Ark functioned as a technology for amplifying human consciousness and connecting to divine power. What mainstream religious teaching never explains is why the Israelites carried this heavy gold-covered box through the desert for 40 years in the first place. Other ancient cultures had similar sacred objects. The Egyptians had their solar barks, the Greeks, the oracle at Delphi, all serving as connecting points between human and divine realms. Joshua somehow learned to harness the Ark's power more effectively than anyone else, even Moses. His long apprenticeship under Moses gave him access to secret knowledge passed down from Egyptian mystery schools, where Moses had been raised. This forbidden connection between Egyptian spiritual technology and Hebrew practices has been systematically erased from religious teaching. Perhaps the most controversial event in Joshua's story is when he supposedly commanded the sun and moon to stand still during battle. Religious leaders have struggled to explain this astronomical impossibility for centuries. But what if it wasn't literal? Ancient astronomical records from Chinese, Babylonian, and Maya cultures all reference unusual celestial events during this approximate time period. Some scholars believe this could have been a rare atmospheric phenomenon or even a near-Earth object passing between Earth and the Sun. Joshua's ability to predict this event and use it strategically in battle suggests he possessed astronomical knowledge far beyond his contemporaries, knowledge that bordered on forbidden territory for his time. What religious authorities really don't want discussed is the bloodline connection. Joshua came from the tribe of Ephraim, a lineage that would later produce numerous prophets and spiritual leaders. This specific genetic line carried certain traits that made accessing spiritual power more natural. Some controversial scholars have suggested that this bloodline carried specific genetic markers that enhanced spiritual perception, a theory that mainstream religious institutions have actively suppressed. The implications are too threatening, that spiritual power might have a biological component, rather than being purely divine gift or moral virtue. Even more shocking is the connection between Joshua and Jesus. Both names derive from the same Hebrew root, Yeshua. Both figures bridged human and divine realms. Both challenged religious authorities of their time. Some suppressed early Christian texts even suggested that Jesus was channeling the spirit of Joshua, accessing the same forbidden spiritual technology. This connection has been systematically downplayed because it implies that spiritual power is transferable knowledge rather than unique divine intervention. The real secret behind Joshua's spiritual power wasn't divine favoritism or random miracle working. It was his understanding of a universal principle, that human consciousness, when properly aligned through specific practices, can directly influence physical reality. The walls of Jericho fell because Joshua understood the resonant frequency of physical structures. The Jordan River parted because he could perceive and influence water's molecular structure through focused consciousness. These explanations sound mystical to modern ears, but they're actually more aligned with quantum physics than with traditional religious teaching. Why has this knowledge been hidden? Throughout history, religious institutions have maintained power by positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between humans and divine power. The idea that individuals could access spiritual power directly, as Joshua did, threatens this control system. The same patterns repeat throughout history. Those who rediscover these forbidden practices are labeled heretics, their teachings suppressed or distorted. Modern spiritual seekers who've studied Joshua's methods have reported remarkable results. By following the patterns of focused intention, aligned with natural cycles, and understanding the energetic properties of physical objects, just as Joshua did with the ark, they've experienced healing, intuitive insights, and synchronicities that defy conventional explanation. These practitioners often face ridicule or accusations of dabbling in the occult, just as Joshua would have if he'd operated outside the authority structure of his time. The most disturbing aspect of this suppression is that these practices aren't evil or dangerous. They're simply powerful. The real forbidden element is that they democratize spiritual power, removing the need for institutional approval or control. Joshua himself eventually established a priesthood system that began the process of restricting this knowledge to an elite few, perhaps realizing its potential for misuse, or perhaps succumbing to the very human desire to control access to power. What does this mean for you? The same power Joshua accessed still exists and follows the same principles. The universe hasn't changed its fundamental laws. Consciousness still interacts with physical reality according to specific patterns. The real question isn't whether this forbidden knowledge is accessible. It's whether you're ready to pursue it despite centuries of conditioning that labels such pursuit dangerous or blasphemous. The next time you read about Joshua's conquests or hear about the walls of Jericho, remember that you're getting the sanitized version of a much more fascinating reality. The truth about spiritual power has always been available, hidden in plain sight for those willing to look beyond conventional explanations. Joshua wasn't just a military leader following divine orders. He was a master practitioner of consciousness technologies that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Ask yourself, if institutions have hidden this knowledge for centuries, what else might they be concealing about your own spiritual potential? The most forbidden secret may be that the power was never in the ark, the rituals, or even in Joshua himself, but in a universal principle that makes such power accessible to anyone willing to study the patterns and practice with dedication. That's the real secret that threatens every power structure, religious or otherwise, and that's the truth they don't want you to know.